It was 1941, and the world stood on a knife's edge. Across the Mediterranean, Axis forces surged through North Africa under the ruthless command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Britain's lifeline to the east, the Suez Canal and its naval stronghold at Gibraltar, were both in peril. If Gibraltar fell, the British Empire would lose control of the gateway between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, a loss that could strangle the Allied war effort. It was here, on this strategic limestone fortress at the tip of Spain, that one of the most chillingly selfless plans of the war began to take shape. The idea was born not in the heat of battle, but in the cold logic of military intelligence. The Admiralty feared that Hitler's forces might sweep through Spain, perhaps with Franco's quiet approval, and seize the Rock of Gibraltar. Such a move would give the Axis dominion over naval traffic, cutting Britain off from its colonies and allies. In a meeting at the Naval Intelligence Division in London, a question was raised. What if the rock fell, but our eyes could remain inside it? Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey, Director of Naval Intelligence, and the man said to have inspired Ian Fleming's M, approved a radical proposal. If the fortress were ever captured, a team of British men would be sealed inside the rock, entombed within a secret chamber, from which they could continue to observe and report enemy movements. The mission was codenamed Operation Tracer. The plan was extraordinary, even by wartime standards. The selected volunteers would live underground in total secrecy, hidden from both enemy and ally. They would transmit intelligence to London through a hidden radio antenna, concealed within the rock face overlooking Gibraltar's harbour. Their mission could last months or years. There would be no rescue, no extraction. If discovered, they were to destroy their equipment and face death by suffocation, starvation, or suicide. One officer reportedly summarized the mission in a single chilling phrase: "To be buried alive for Britain." At the time, Gibraltar was a fortress under siege in all but name. The rock was honeycombed with over 30 miles of tunnels, military barracks, hospitals, ammunition stores, and command centers carved deep into limestone. From the outside, the civilian population endured food shortages and nightly blackouts, their lives governed by the distant thunder of the war at sea. The fortress was the key to Britain's Mediterranean defense, and everyone knew Hitler coveted it. Behind closed doors, intelligence officers began to assess the logistics. How could men survive sealed underground? How much air, water, and food would they need? Could radio signals reach London through solid rock? Questions piled upon questions, and answers were drawn from the fields of medicine, engineering, and sheer imagination. Every aspect of Operation Tracer had to be engineered for survival in total isolation. The responsibility for designing the secret chamber fell to Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Shepherd, Royal Engineers, a man known for his precision and discretion. He envisioned a small, airtight space, barely larger than a train carriage, hidden within the rock's northern slopes. The site would offer a view of the harbour and the straits beyond, giving the men a direct line of sight on enemy naval movements. A narrow observation slit would be camouflaged with natural rock, invisible from the outside. As the plan developed, so too did its moral weight. Doctors from the Royal Navy's medical service warned of the psychological effects of confinement. 6 men cut off from sunlight would face inevitable strain, paranoia, hallucinations, perhaps madness. Yet the Admiralty persisted. In a war where entire cities burned under Luftwaffe bombs, sacrifice had become a daily currency. By late 1941, as German forces advanced through North Africa, the urgency deepened. Operation Tracer moved from concept to construction. Engineers and naval officers began scouting potential locations inside the rock. Each visit required cover stories to deflect suspicion. Even within the military garrison, only a handful of individuals were cleared to know the truth. The mission's existence was not to appear in any official file or registry. To the outside world, Gibraltar seemed an impregnable bastion. To those behind Operation Tracer, it was a potential tomb. Few missions in military history demanded such devotion, or such quiet fatalism. The men chosen for this task would not only be fighting for their country, they would be surrendering their freedom to serve it. Their duty would not be measured in victories or medals, but in silence, endurance, and anonymity. As 1941 drew to a close, the order was given: the chamber would be built, deep inside the Rock of Gibraltar, beneath centuries of stone and secrecy. British engineers began to carve out a space meant to hold the last defenders of the fortress. a hidden eye in the dark. But as the tunnels deepened and the plan took form, so too did the chilling reality of what it would mean. Operation Tracer was no longer an idea. It was becoming a living grave. And for the 6 men soon to be chosen, the question was not whether they could complete the mission, but whether they could survive it. In early 1942, as the war stretched into its 3rd brutal year, the British Empire faced one of its most precarious moments. The fall of Singapore had shocked the world, and the Axis seemed unstoppable across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Gibraltar, perched at the entrance to the Mediterranean, had become more than a strategic outpost. It was a symbol of defiance. But deep inside the Admiralty's intelligence rooms in London, another battle was being fought, a war of secrecy, preparation, and unimaginable sacrifice. Operation Tracer was no longer a theory, it was a directive. Rear Admiral John Henry Godfrey, the cool, analytical head of naval intelligence, pressed his subordinates to bring the plan to life. If Germany invaded Spain, they would almost certainly take Gibraltar. The fortress could not be allowed to go blind. Somewhere within the massive network of tunnels, 6 men would be sealed inside a hidden chamber to watch and listen as the world above possibly fell to the enemy. To lead the mission, the Admiralty turned to Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Shepherd of the Royal Engineers, a disciplined officer with a reputation for precision. He would oversee the technical design of the secret room. The operational responsibility, however, fell under the command of the Royal Navy. A liaison team, including Surgeon Commander George Murray Levick, a veteran of Scott's Antarctic expedition, and Surgeon Lieutenant Ernest Woolley, was formed to advise on human endurance and survival under extreme confinement. Levick, having once survived being trapped in ice for months, knew what it meant to exist on the edge of human limits. Recruitment began under the strictest secrecy. Every man approached for Operation Tracer had to meet a brutal psychological profile: intelligence, resilience, and an almost fanatical sense of duty. They were told little at first, only that it was a special operation of national importance, and that they would likely never return if activated. Those who hesitated were quietly dismissed. Those who agreed were bound by the Official Secrets Act and by an unspoken understanding. Their graves would be carved in stone. By spring 1942, the list was narrowed to 6 primary volunteers: 2 doctors, a wireless operator, 2 seamen, and 1 officer to command. Each would play a vital role. The doctors would maintain physical and mental health. The wireless operator would handle radio transmissions to London, and the seaman would perform observation and maintenance duties. The officer, whose name remains uncertain even in declassified files, would bear ultimate responsibility for ensuring the mission's continuation, even if some of his men succumbed to despair or death. The men began training at undisclosed facilities in England and Gibraltar. They practiced radio operations on modified Mark III transmitters designed for long-range communication through stone interference. They learned how to preserve air quality by managing ventilation manually and filtering carbon dioxide using chemical compounds. Food stocks were tested: tinned meat, powdered milk, vitamin supplements, and water purification tablets. Every item had to last at least a year, possibly longer, without resupply. Even death was accounted for. Plans were made to seal the bodies of the deceased in the chamber's lower section to prevent contamination. The human aspect was even more daunting. A psychological report from the Admiralty Medical Branch warned, "A man confined in darkness with no prospect of relief may turn to self-destruction within weeks." To counter this, daily routines were enforced: exercise drills, strict sleep cycles, and mandatory reading from a small selection of books. Discipline was to become their survival. Meanwhile, in Gibraltar, rumors spread among the garrison about secret ghost tunnels being constructed within the rock. Only a handful of officers truly knew what was happening. Even among them, few grasped the full moral gravity of the mission. Commander Levick wrote in his personal notes, "They will live as moles beneath the world, watching the tide of war through a slit of light." His words reflected both admiration and dread. To conceal the operation, the cover story described the chamber as part of a new observation post. Workers rotated in shifts, never allowed to return to the same site twice. The entrance was disguised behind a false wall of limestone rubble, indistinguishable from natural rock. Inside, engineers installed hidden ventilation shafts, narrow enough to prevent detection by sound or instruments. The radio aerial was to be built into the upper rock face. its wires disguised as natural mineral veins. By mid-1942, the framework of Operation Tracer stood ready in draft form, an invisible eye waiting for the war's worst outcome. And yet, for all its meticulous planning, the mission remained haunted by uncertainty. Would the radio work through the dense rock? Could men truly survive months without sunlight, in silence and secrecy? No one knew for sure. The men chosen for the task were ordered to remain on standby. They would be called only if the Germans moved toward Gibraltar, a possibility that, in 1942, felt terrifyingly real. Hitler's Operation Felix, the proposed invasion of Spain and Gibraltar, still loomed in strategic discussions in Berlin. Each volunteer carried his secret quietly. Some wrote final letters to loved ones, sealed away in Admiralty archives. Others simply waited, silent, their fates tied to an operation that might never be known. In London, Admiral Godfrey signed off on the readiness report. Tracer may now be activated at any notice of invasion. The plan was in place, the chamber ready, and 6 men chosen to give their lives for intelligence that might never be sent. But no one could predict what would come next. The grinding weight, the hidden construction, and the ghosts that would later inhabit Gibraltar's tunnels. Operation Tracer had moved from concept to commitment. Now it only waited for the call that, mercifully, would never come. By the summer of 1942, deep within the labyrinth of Gibraltar's tunnels, Operation Tracer moved from blueprint to stone. The mission was no longer an idea whispered in the Admiralty's halls. It was a structure taking physical form inside the very heart of the rock. Engineers, guided by Lieutenant Colonel John Henry Shepherd of the Royal Engineers, began carving what would become one of the most secret and morbidly ingenious chambers of World War II. The chosen site was a secluded section of the rock's upper northern slopes, high above the town and facing the bay. It was close enough to observe the harbour and straits, but isolated enough that even Gibraltar's garrison wouldn't stumble across it. Access was disguised through a narrow, winding passage that appeared to lead nowhere. Behind a false rock wall, masons began chiselling out a rectangular cavity, barely large enough to hold 6 men, their supplies, and the radio station that would keep them in contact with London. Every strike of the hammer was a secret, every handful of debris hauled away under cover of darkness. Inside, the engineers created 2 chambers, one for living and observation, and one for transmitting radio messages. The observation slit, facing the harbour, was barely the width of a finger, camouflaged with wire mesh and painted to match the limestone surface. Through it, the hidden watchers could see the waters below, where Axis convoys or U-boats might one day anchor if Gibraltar fell. The slit's design was so clever that even today, it is difficult to spot unless you know precisely where to look. The air system was one of the chamber's most intricate features. Ventilation shafts were drilled vertically to the surface, their openings hidden among natural crevices. Small valves allowed the occupants to regulate airflow, preventing suffocation or detection by heat signatures. Every technical choice reflected grim foresight. This was a tomb engineered for life. Within the radio room, technicians installed a Mark III transmitter, customized to operate in confined conditions. The aerial, concealed in the rock face, was designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding mineral veins. Power was to be generated by hand-cranked dynamos, meaning the men would literally power their own survival. The radio would transmit on pre-arranged frequencies to stations in Tangier or Malta, using coded Morse to report ship movements and enemy activity. Rations were carefully calculated by naval medical officers. The store included tinned foods, powdered milk, dehydrated vegetables, salt, and hard biscuits. Water was stored in sealed containers, with purification tablets to extend its use. The total supply was designed to last 12 months, but provisions for rationing could stretch survival to 18. Sanitation was primitive, a sealed latrine system using chemical neutralizers. Every necessity of life was reduced to its barest, most mechanical function. The psychological strain, however, could not be engineered away. Surgeon Commander George Murray Levick, one of the operation's medical advisors, raised grave concerns. Levick, who had survived isolation during Scott's Antarctic expedition, warned that confinement could erode sanity within weeks. He recommended rotating leadership roles, maintaining daily routines, and enforcing structured conversation to stave off mental collapse. His notes read, "In the absence of daylight or relief, The mind will invent its own horizons. They must be given purpose every hour. Despite these warnings, the work continued. Construction teams, none of whom knew the full purpose of what they were building, completed the chamber by late autumn 1942. Shepard himself inspected the site, ensuring every detail aligned with operational secrecy. To test the system, a handful of engineers volunteered to spend several nights inside. Even in that brief time, the effects were unnerving. The air felt heavy, the silence absolute. One participant later recalled, "After a few hours, you could hear your own heartbeat echo off the rock." Outside the tunnels, the war pressed on. Rommel's Africa Corps fought desperately across Egypt and Libya, while Allied convoys battled U-boat attacks through the Strait of Gibraltar. Intelligence reports indicated that German forces continued to pressure Franco for access to the rock, though Spain's official neutrality held. Each new rumor of invasion breathed urgency into Operation Tracer's completion. Still, the secrecy was absolute. Only a handful of officers, Admiral Godfrey in London, Shepard in Gibraltar, and a few select staff, knew of the mission's true purpose. To the rest of the garrison, the ongoing construction was just another defensive improvement, one of hundreds scattered throughout the fortress. When the final inspection concluded, the chamber was sealed behind its disguised entrance. Supplies were packed inside. The radio was tested and logged as ready. The ventilation shafts were camouflaged, and the observation slit painted to vanish into the stone. For all intents and purposes, the chamber disappeared from the map. Only those in the know could find it, and they were forbidden to speak of it. In December 1942, a classified report reached the Admiralty. Operation Tracer, chamber prepared and provisioned, awaiting activation order upon confirmation of enemy occupation. It was the last official line in the operation's early records before the files went dark. The men who would inhabit the chamber continued their training in Gibraltar, unaware if or when they would be called. Every day they looked up at the towering rock, knowing their lives could soon belong to it. In quiet conversations, they wondered how long they could endure the silence, the darkness, and the knowledge that the war might continue for years while they remained buried alive. Above them, the Mediterranean glimmered deceptively calm. Beneath their feet, their tomb awaited, fully stocked, meticulously designed, and utterly final. Operation Tracer was ready. All that remained was the call to seal the entrance. But fate, as history would later show, had other plans. By early 1943, Operation Tracer had entered its final phase, human readiness. The chamber was built, provisioned, and sealed, an invisible fortress hidden within the Rock of Gibraltar. Now all that remained was to prepare the men who might one day live and die inside it. For the Chosen Six, this was no ordinary training. It was preparation for voluntary burial. The final team had been carefully hand-picked through psychological screening and physical trials. The group included Surgeon Lieutenant Ernest Woolley and Surgeon Commander George Murray Levick, two Royal Navy doctors whose presence was vital to ensure physical and mental stability during isolation. Alongside them were a wireless operator and 3 naval ratings, each trained to maintain equipment, record enemy movements, and sustain the rhythm of survival in total confinement. The commanding officer, a quiet, steady man whose name remains uncertain in official records, was tasked with maintaining discipline when morale inevitably cracked. Their training began in secret locations across Gibraltar and Britain. They practiced living without natural light, existing on rationed food, and maintaining complete radio silence except during scheduled transmissions. The wireless operator drilled endlessly on using the modified Mark III transmitter under conditions of exhaustion and low oxygen. The medical officers studied how to recycle air, administer sedatives, and manage psychological breakdowns without compromising the mission. In every exercise, one question lingered. How long could 6 men endure life entombed in stone? To simulate confinement, the men spent extended periods in sealed compartments within Gibraltar's tunnel system. The first days were bearable. They worked, read, and spoke in low tones to pass the hours. But as the air grew stale and the darkness thickened, tension mounted. Even small noises, a cough, the drip of condensation, took on unbearable weight. One participant later recalled that after 48 hours underground, time stopped meaning anything. They began to understand what their future might hold. Psychological reports from this period, declassified decades later, reveal the depth of their challenge. Commander Levick wrote in his notebook, "Discipline will be the single barrier between sanity and surrender. Without structure, 6 men will destroy one another." He prescribed a rigid daily routine, fixed hours for observation, exercise, meals, and sleep, shared reading from the Bible or novels, and scheduled maintenance tasks to prevent idleness. Even emotional control was part of training. Arguments were forbidden, and each man was required to record his thoughts in a private log, a form of therapy in isolation. Still, doubts persisted within the Admiralty. Would these men survive if Operation Tracer were activated? Would the human spirit endure the crushing silence and finality of being buried alive? Lieutenant Colonel Shepard, who oversaw the engineering side, confessed his unease in a private memo. "We have built a coffin, not a bunker. The living will serve the dead." Yet the project continued. To the Admiralty, the intelligence advantage outweighed all risk. Meanwhile, events outside the Rock gave both urgency and a fragile sense of reprieve. The German advance through North Africa had begun to falter. The Allies were preparing for Operation Torch, the landings in Morocco and Algeria, which would shift the balance of power in the Mediterranean. If Gibraltar remained in British hands, Operation Tracer might never be needed, but no one in Gibraltar could be certain of that yet. In early 1943, the 6 volunteers were placed on permanent standby. They were ordered to remain within Gibraltar's military perimeter, ready to be sealed in the chamber at a moment's notice should an invasion occur. Their daily lives became an exercise in waiting. Each sunrise a reminder that activation could come that day or never. None of them could tell their comrades what their true mission was. Even among Gibraltar's 16,000-strong garrison, only a handful of officers were aware that 6 men lived under the shadow of a secret tomb. Medical preparations grew increasingly meticulous. WWII devised protocols for waste disposal, infection control, and burial of the dead within the chamber itself. Small doses of morphine were stored for emergencies, or, as one report suggested, to ease suffering should continuation of life be impossible. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of the mission's finality. To the volunteers, courage was not the absence of fear, it was coexistence with it. They practiced Morse code messages they might one day send through stone, short bursts like ghostly whispers. Enemy ships in harbour. Axis aircraft over straits. Tracer reporting. Each imagined message carried the weight of isolation and the hope that somewhere, in London or Malta, someone would hear. Then, almost without warning, the world began to shift. In November 1942, Operation Torch succeeded beyond expectation. Allied forces took control of North Africa, pushing Axis power further east. The immediate threat to Gibraltar began to fade. Hitler's plans for an invasion of Spain, codenamed Operation Felix, were shelved indefinitely. The Rock, the gateway to the Mediterranean, remained firmly British. For Operation Tracer, this geopolitical turn meant limbo. The men continued their training, their readiness reports updated monthly, yet the order to activate never came. They waited through 1943, through the slow collapse of Axis resistance in Tunisia, and into 1944, as the tide of war turned decisively against Germany. The secret chamber, once imagined as Britain's last outpost, became a relic before it was ever used. Still, no one dared to dismantle it. The war was unpredictable, and the Admiralty ordered the chamber sealed and maintained in a ready state. For the 6 men of Operation Tracer, the waiting became its own kind of endurance test. An invisible service that left no medals, no records, only silence. By mid-1944, as Allied armies prepared for D-Day, the men were quietly released from duty and reassigned. Operation Tracer had fulfilled its purpose not by activation, but by readiness. Yet none of them were permitted to speak of what they had trained for. Their secret would remain buried with the Rock itself. And so, the chamber slept, sealed, silent and forgotten. Its purpose unfulfilled, but its story far from over. Decades later, when it was rediscovered, the world would once again ask, who were the men who volunteered to be buried alive for Britain? And what became of them after the war's end? As the war progressed into 1945, the world's attention turned to the final collapse of Nazi Germany, yet deep inside Gibraltar, Operation Tracer remained a silent testament to wartime ingenuity and fear. The 6 men, once selected and trained for the mission of living entombed within the Rock, had returned to conventional military duties. They carried with them a burden few could imagine, a secret so profound that even their closest comrades were unaware. Their training, the chamber, and the months of psychological preparation were all maintained in perfect secrecy, a ghostly shadow of what might have been. With the Axis retreating across Europe and North Africa, the immediate threat to Gibraltar diminished. Hitler's plans for invading Spain and seizing the Rock, Operation Felix, had been indefinitely postponed, effectively neutralized by the Allied victories in North Africa and the ongoing D-Day preparations. For Britain, the strategic importance of Gibraltar remained, but the necessity for Operation Tracer had evaporated. The Admiralty faced a decision: to dismantle the hidden chamber or to leave it intact, a silent sentinel within the rock. They chose secrecy. The chamber was never destroyed. It was carefully maintained, its entrance sealed behind a false wall of limestone rubble, ventilation shafts hidden, and observation slit concealed. Periodic inspections ensured the structure remained intact, while all operational records were classified under the Official Secrets Act. Even the men who had been trained for the mission were forbidden to speak of it, their identities and experiences locked away in personal silence. The entire operation, designed to be a lifeline of intelligence in the event of occupation, was now a historical ghost, lying dormant yet fully equipped. Decades passed, and the world outside Gibraltar transformed. The Rock, once a fortress bristling with military installations and tunnels, gradually became a symbol of heritage and tourism. Locals and visitors wandered through its open tunnels, unaware of the hidden chamber that lay sealed within. Occasionally, stories circulated among veterans or tunnel workers, rumors of secret rooms, of long-forgotten equipment, of a phantom team that might have once lived underground. Most dismissed these as wartime folklore, legends born of imagination rather than fact. Yet the truth endured, buried within the limestone. In 1997, a team of local explorers, historians, and archaeologists set out to investigate old military tunnels inside the rock. Guided by partial blueprints and cryptic references from archived intelligence documents, they discovered a narrow, hidden passage. Behind a false wall, they found the sealed chamber, compact, air-ventilated, and equipped with the original radio room, bunks, storage containers, and observation slit. Everything was intact, frozen in time as if the 6 men had just stepped out for a moment. The chamber's discovery confirmed decades of speculation. Operation Tracer was real. Inside the chamber, the evidence spoke to the mission's stark reality. The bunks bore the marks of use, though no one had ever occupied them. The radio room still contained the hand-cranked dynamo mount and the concealed wiring for the aerial. Cans of food, chemical neutralizers for waste, and preserved rations remained untouched, a chilling reminder of the preparations for a life entombed. The psychological instruments of training, exercise manuals, ration schedules, and diaries demonstrated the meticulous planning required to survive complete isolation. It was a tomb built for life, a paradox of engineering and human endurance. The discovery prompted historians and military analysts to reassess Britain's wartime preparedness. Operation Tracer, unlike most contingency plans, reflected an extreme willingness to sacrifice human life in the name of intelligence. It was a plan that required courage, discipline, and acceptance of mortality beyond what most soldiers would ever encounter. It also illuminated the hidden layers of the British war effort, decisions made in absolute secrecy, unseen by both allies and enemies, to protect strategic assets at any cost. For the volunteers, the legacy of Operation Tracer remained personal and untold. Most had lived out their lives quietly after the war, never discussing the mission with family or colleagues. They were forgotten by history, their names absent from official records or medal rolls. Yet their training, courage, and readiness embodied a moral and strategic commitment few could fathom: the willingness to surrender freedom, comfort, and life itself for the sake of country. The chamber remained a silent monument for decades, a stark reminder that the stakes of war often extend far beyond the battlefield. Operation Tracer had never been activated, yet its existence underscored a truth of wartime intelligence. The most valuable operations are often those that never occur. The men who trained to live entombed within the rock had, in essence, fulfilled their mission simply by being prepared. Their sacrifice was invisible, their courage hidden, but their story would eventually emerge, offering a window into the extremities of human endurance under war's shadow. And yet, Questions lingered. Who were the volunteers, and what became of them after the war? How did they reconcile the knowledge of a tomb they never entered? And what does it reveal about the lengths nations will go to protect strategic advantage? Operation Tracer, though dormant, had left behind these enduring mysteries, waiting for history to illuminate the human stories buried within the Rock of Gibraltar. Decades after World War II, Gibraltar had transformed from a fortress of war into a symbol of resilience and heritage. Tourists strolled along its sunlit promenades, unaware of the labyrinthine tunnels beneath their feet. Tunnels that once hummed with military preparation and whispered of untold secrets. Yet hidden deep inside the rock, Operation Tracer's chamber lay undisturbed, a silent, meticulously engineered testament to human endurance, courage, and secrecy. The rediscovery came in 1997, almost 55 years after the war ended. A team of explorers, historians, and archaeologists had been investigating long-abandoned military tunnels within the rock. Guided by fragments of declassified intelligence documents and the persistent rumors of locals and veterans, they stumbled upon a narrow false wall. Behind it lay the entrance to the sealed chamber, exactly as wartime plans had described. Compact, air-ventilated, and equipped with the original radio room, observation slit, bunks, and storage containers. Everything remained frozen in time, as though the 6 men had simply stepped out for a brief moment. Inside, the chamber revealed its haunting story. Hand-cranked dynamos, ration tins, chemical neutralizers for waste, and meticulously arranged supplies lay untouched. The observation slit, painted to blend with the limestone, offered a chilling view of the harbor, just as the hidden watchers would have seen it if the mission had been activated. Training notes, diaries, and equipment instructions demonstrated the level of preparation required for living buried alive for months or even a year. It was a space designed not only to sustain life, but to withstand isolation, stress, and the psychological toll of total confinement. Historians and military analysts were struck by the operation's audacity. Operation Tracer had never been activated, yet it reflected the extreme measures Britain was willing to take to preserve intelligence during wartime. It also highlighted the extraordinary bravery and commitment of the volunteers, men who had trained for a mission that demanded total sacrifice, ready to live in total darkness, isolated, and possibly never emerge. Their courage, largely invisible to history until the chamber's discovery, embodied a rare intersection of human endurance and strategic foresight. The volunteers themselves had long since moved on. Some had returned to normal military service. Others left the armed forces entirely, carrying the burden of the secret alone. Their identities remained largely unknown, protected by the Official Secrets Act. For these men, the mission was fulfilled not through action, but through readiness, the willingness to give themselves entirely to a task that might never come to fruition. Their story was one of discipline, loyalty, and quiet heroism. The chamber's discovery sparked renewed interest in the hidden aspects of World War II intelligence operations. It offered a tangible glimpse into contingency planning at its most extreme, a strategy conceived in fear, executed in secrecy, and preserved in silence. Operation Tracer became a case study in human resilience, engineering ingenuity, and the moral weight of wartime decision-making. It demonstrated that war's most profound acts are often invisible, existing in the shadows, known to only a select few, and remembered by even fewer. Yet the chamber also posed questions that remain unanswered. Who precisely were the 6 men prepared to sacrifice everything for their country? How did they reconcile the knowledge of a tomb they might have entered? And what inner reflections did they carry for decades, knowing that their mission, though unactivated, symbolized ultimate dedication and obedience? For historians, the chamber is both a treasure trove and a riddle, a tangible reminder of how far nations will go to protect strategy and how silently ordinary men can bear extraordinary burdens. Operation Tracer, hidden in the Rock of Gibraltar, had become more than a wartime contingency plan. It was a story of courage and suspense, a testament to the extraordinary lengths that ordinary men were willing to go in service of their country. The Rock, which had stood sentinel over centuries of conflict, had quietly housed a mission of unparalleled secrecy, a mission to bury men alive if the fate of the world required it. The chamber remains a silent monument today, a preserved relic of human determination and strategic brilliance. It reminds us that the shadow of war is not always visible in the headlines or on the battlefield. Sometimes it lies deep underground, in darkness and silence, waiting to tell its story. And when it does, the courage of those who volunteered, the ingenuity of those who planned, and the moral weight of the decisions they faced resonate across decades, leaving a legacy that is as haunting as it is heroic. In the end, Operation Tracer was never activated. The men were never sealed within the rock. Yet the chamber, discovered decades later, immortalizes the mission that never had to be carried out. It stands as a quiet, formidable testament to the human spirit, to wartime innovation, and to the courage required to confront the unthinkable.